in English. I start on the wrong foot. Good evening. It's so great to see you here in such great numbers for a very important subject. We are going to talk tonight. Can you hear me fine? Yeah? Okay. We're going to talk tonight about corruption in Russia, but also about the role we play in facilitating that corruption. This is a very somewhat abstract topic sometimes, and we thought it would be good to start with a video explaining how this works. So how does money from Russia how does it go through Dutch banks, maybe shell companies on islands we all like to visit for our holidays, and how does it affect our banks here or our politics here? So first we are going to look at a video. It was a fraud scheme revealed by a group of investigative journalists in Eastern Europe. So please, let's take a look.
This is Troika Dialogue, once Russia's premier investment bank. And this was Troika's president, Ruben Vardanyan, a Russian-Armenian businessman who is known for his friendly relationships with the West. Publicly, Troika was a powerful financial institution led by one of Russia's most progressive businessmen. Behind the scenes, the bank was devising a hidden system of offshore companies that helped Russia's elites launder money, hide their assets, and evade the law. Here is how Troika's laundromat worked. Troika established 3 offshore companies in the British Virgin Islands. These 3 companies paid formation agents to establish dozens of other companies to funnel the money out of Russia. Money flowed between these companies in a coordinated network. Many of the transactions were disguised as fake trade contracts and loans. This system allowed corrupt politicians and organized crime to buy luxury goods with complete anonymity. To make this transfer of money possible, Troika needed a bank that would turn a blind eye to its dubious financial transactions. Enter Ukio Bankas, a Lithuanian bank that shuffled millions of dollars through Troika's system before it was closed by regulators. Troika also relied on unwitting proxies to obscure the identity of the shell company's real owners. Reporters spoke to this man, an Armenian construction worker, who was unaware that his signature appears on financial agreements worth more than $70 million in the laundromat. So who was benefiting from this multi-billion-dollar network? You might recognize some of the names in this cast of characters. Companies affiliated with Sergei Guriev, a cellist and alleged proxy of Putin, received $69 million from the pipeline. The family of Vladimir Orzhikov, the former governor of the Samara region of Russia, used money from the pipeline to purchase a $16.6 million property in Spain. Vardanyan himself used $3.2 million from the pipeline to pay his credit card and his children's school fees in London. These names are just the tip of the iceberg. Reporters found more than 75 companies and hundreds of millions of dollars connected to the Troika network. When reporters spoke to Vardanyan, he said he couldn't be aware of all of Troika's transactions and that his bank acted legally. There is no definitive proof that Vardanyan knew of Troika's scheme, and he has not been accused of wrongdoing by authorities. But by pulling back the curtain on this scheme, we see how Troika allowed powerful people to move their vast wealth offshore for their own gain, at the detriment of the countries they live in, and the quality of life for everyday citizens.
So this is just one of the many stories that broke these last few years about money laundering from countries like Russia to the West. You might have heard of the money laundering scheme at Danske Bank, which Danske Bank was involved in, which involved 200 billion euros, an enormous fraud. You might have heard a year ago, ING settled with the Dutch Department of Justice for 775 million euros for not preventing their accounts being abused for money laundering. You remember the Panama Papers, the Paradise Papers, the list goes on. So this is not an incident, this is a very important subject, but it's not always maybe written enough as it should. My name is up here, is Marike Stellinga. I work for the Dutch newspaper NRC. I'm very happy and delighted that I can moderate this evening, which was organized by Raam op Rusland and the Rode Hoed, Window on Russia. And I'm delighted that they have succeeded in getting such a prominent guest, Mr. Sergei Guriev. He is a, yes. He is now a professor in Paris at the Paris Institute of Political Studies. He was a chief economist at the European Bank for Reconstruction and Development. In 2013, he left Russia because he did not feel secure there anymore, when he was a rector of the new economic school in Moscow, and he was part of the supervisory board of one of the biggest banks in Russia, Sberbank. He also advised at that time, or before that time, the Russian government, Mr. Medvedev. So please give him a very warm welcome, Mr. Sergei Guriev.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for coming, indeed, and thank you very much for such a warm introduction, Marike. And I didn't know what kind of video will be shown, but this is indeed a perfect introduction to what I was going to talk about. I will be speaking as a private individual and an academic doing research on corruption and on regimes like this. But I indeed used to work at the BRD, at the European Bank for Reconstruction and Development, and I will not speak on behalf of EBRD. My views will not reflect what EBRD thinks, but I should say that while I was at EBRD, we actually worked a lot on anti-corruption policies and governance, and personally, I feel very proud that I was part of this shift, which is now going on in many international financial institutions, most importantly at IMF, but in EBRD as well, where we put governance and anti-corruption as a part of a definition of what we want to build in our countries. And of course, that creates a lot of challenges because you work in countries like Baltic states, where you have those money laundering scandals. We work in countries like Moldova, where until 3 years ago, we would not be able to invest in any bank because none of the banks had transparent ownership. Only after a very courageous central banker came to Moldova and cleaned up by now 3 banks, we were able to invest. We actually co-invest in Armenia with Ruben Vardanyan in a bank called Ameria Bank, and that is actually a good Armenian bank. But then, of course, EBRD was mentioned in this story when it broke out because we are co-investing with Ruben. And I know Ruben very well, and as Marike mentioned, I was a board member of Sberbank when Sberbank bought Troika. And so I can, maybe when we answer questions, I will talk about that. But interestingly, Sberbank, even being a state-owned bank, didn't want to buy that part of Troika business. So we actually stayed away from what's called Avtoinvest, and the investment of Troika into Kamaz and Avtovaz automotive plants, because we thought it's connected to certain politically important individuals. But at that point, I had no clue that it would be this cellist, Sergei Raldugin, who seems to be representing financial interests of Russian president. We thought somebody a level below would be involved, but luckily for Sberbank didn't buy these assets. Now, let me say first what I'm going to talk about. So I will first describe the state of corruption, the level of corruption in Russia. Then I'll talk about the impact of corruption on companies and citizens. Then I'll talk about why corruption exists in Russia, who supports fight against corruption and who slows it down, if you like political economy of corruption. Then I'll talk about the role of the West. And then I'll try to conclude on what I would suggest the West should do. And then I will try to end on an optimistic note, which may or may not be easy. So first, on the level of corruption. When we discussed this talk, people said, well, you're an economist, you will talk about numbers, give us something which is less numerical and more tangible. So I'll give you a couple of tangible examples. So one is something that struck me, was what happened exactly 10 years ago. The top Russian business newspaper decided to take photos that they have of Russian bureaucrats and check how expensive their watches are. And that was a big deal, and I was surprised. I never knew that watches as expensive exist. So the most expensive watch in that picture was something like $1 million. And a top Russian banker, not Sberbank, but a competitor, had a watch which was worth $200,000. And in that universe, Mr. Putin was actually a modest person with a watch of $10,000 only. But then he was actually given that watch as a gift to people he met in various campaign events. So he would shake hands with the worker, and the worker would say, this is a nice watch, and Mr. Putin would give this watch, and next time he gives another watch like this. So he particularly likes this particular watch. Now, Mr. Putin's salary, as you may know, is something like $100,000 a year. So giving out watches $10,000 worth is a strange habit. So let me give you another example, which is going to be very relevant to what I'm going to talk about, which is what Russian society knows about corruption. And this is somewhat related to both visuals and numbers. So if you ask people in Russia what corruption is, what you know about corruption, that would be one particular video published by the leading Russian anti-corruption activist and opposition politician, Alexei Navalny, about current Russian prime minister and former Russian president. Marike mentioned his name, Dmitry Medvedev. And so this video showing the 7 palaces of Mr. Medvedev, his winery in Italy, and other things that he uses his money for. And so this video was watched by 32 million people. So this is by far the biggest viewership of anti-corruption investigation in Russia. And Marike mentioned that I was advising that government, and honestly, for me, even for me, that video was a big revelation. I would never think that something like this would be going on. And actually, for me personally, it's a big blow to what I've been doing before, because I was always somewhat disappointed that the reforms we were discussing were not implemented. By now, I kind of understand why, because these people were very busy with other things, setting up structures that were discussed, buying palaces, buying expensive wine, and they were too busy to implement reforms. Now, the other hierarchy of those videos, so this is not just one video, you can also go down through Alexei Navalny's YouTube channel, and you would see videos which are watched by 10 million people. So that would be a video about Russian prosecutor general Chaika and his sons, who happen to be very successful businessmen in the industries connected to the state, but also connected to organized crime. That is only 10 million 10 million viewers who watch this video. You would also see videos about Mr. Putin's palace. Mr. Putin doesn't have one palace, so 7 palaces. He has about 20, but some of them are more or less secret. And so one of those videos is 10 million viewers. Another 10 million viewers video is a video about Russian oligarch Oleg Deripaska, who is now sanctioned by the US. welcoming a deputy prime minister, discussing with him how they would actually influence American politics. They talk about this on his yacht, and of course the whole story is fascinating because all of that is pretty much shot on the smartphone by an escort lady who then wrote a book about this, and somehow nobody read this book before that video. But so you have all these facets of corruption which come out of adventure novels. You don't believe how it may happen today when everything is so transparent, everything is so clear. And this is what I would like to talk about. I would like to explain why this transparency, why all these leaks don't undermine the legitimacy of the regime that so much depends on corruption. So let me now talk about the numbers. So how much is stolen, how expansive corruption is. So some numbers are very small. So if you look at shadow economist ratio to GDP, then various estimates differ, but if you look at the value added, the part of GDP that is in the shadow sector, we talk about something like 20%. This is not trivial, but this is not huge. Now, some other numbers start becoming bigger. If you ask Mr. Medvedev himself how much of, for example, government spending is embezzled, he would be very furious and he would tell you 20% of government spending is actually embezzled, and government spending is 10% of GDP, so 2% is actually stolen by government bureaucrats themselves. But when we talk about amount of money that's been taken out of Russia, and this is very much connected to this particular video, we are talking about something like $1 trillion. From 800 billion to $1 trillion is Russia's offshore wealth. Is that a lot or little? So Russia's total household wealth, so Russians overall have wealth of something like $2.2 trillion. So about half of Russian wealth is offshore. And later in my talk, I'll try to connect that to Russian elites. This wealth is not distributed evenly. It's concentrated at the very top of Russian wealth distribution. Now, another important measure is how corrupt Russia is relative to countries at a similar income level, similar levels of development. So there are many surveys that try to ask business people, experts, citizens themselves whether this country is more corrupt than that country. And what the World Bank does, the World Bank aggregates those surveys and it can give you the ranking of all countries. And this is what's called worldwide governance indicators. And then you can actually see that, of course, rich countries are less corrupt. This country is actually quite clean. The cleanest countries are Nordic countries and New Zealand. Then you have some rich countries which are corrupt. These are Middle Eastern monarchies. And then Russia, in that ranking, is much more corrupt than countries at similar level of development. How much more? By what's called one standard deviation. So for those people who know the numbers, in the whole world measure, Russia is below the trend line by one standard deviation, which means Russia is as corrupt as countries which are 20 times as poor. So Russia is as corrupt in those data, which are the best data on corruption, as Mozambique and Madagascar. And this is pretty scary because Russia overall is a very educated country and an upper middle income country with a reasonably high level of development. Now, let me talk briefly about the impact of corruption. So how do we measure the impact of corruption? So this is what we've done at the BRD, and this is why I don't want to show slides, not to steal the thunder from the forthcoming transition report, the annual flagship publication for which we produce these numbers, but I no longer work there, and so I let my colleagues from the BRD to present that. But basically what we do, we have firm surveys, and we try to measure which firms are more likely to be corrupt, less likely to be corrupt, which characteristics predict corruption, and then we try to figure out whether corruption, due to factors which are exogenously determined, cause lower firm growth. So our estimate is that every standard deviation in corruption costs firms' growth going down by 1.4%. Our estimates suggest that if Russia, which is, as I said, is very corrupt, reduced its governance gap towards advanced economies, so became not like Netherlands, but more like Croatia, which is a reasonably clean country in the transition region, in post-communist region. So if Russia became less corrupt and became not as clean as Netherlands, but as clean as Croatia, Russian economic growth would be faster by 1 percentage point a year. And I can talk a lot about those methods if you have questions, but in general, we try to do as rigorous job as possible to come to these numbers. But basically, when Russian government talks about the need to accelerate economic growth, fighting corruption would actually bring a lot. We also look at impact on citizens. So one ultimate measure of quality of life is, of course, life satisfaction, happiness. We run around, we ask people, are you satisfied with your life? And people say, well, today I'm happy 7 out of 10. Another person will tell you, I'm happy 5 out of 10, and so on. And so we try to see people who live in more corrupt regions, less corrupt regions, more corrupt countries and less corrupt countries. And we see that corruption is costly for happiness. So even if you control for having a job, your own education, your family size, your age, your access to public goods, your salary, you still don't like corruption. Corruption makes you unhappy, even in countries where media freedom is limited. Even if people don't know the true level of corruption, whatever news about corruption they get makes them unhappier, and this effect is also substantial. One implication of that effect, which is very important for countries like Russia, but other post-communist countries as well, is the intention to emigrate. Unlike what people think, in those countries, only about 3 or 4% on average have tangible intentions to emigrate. That means when you come to them and ask them, do you want to emigrate in the next 12 months? And if yes, which country to? Which country do you want to go to? About 3 or 4%, and in Russia actually more like 2.5%, people would say yes. So corruption explains 1 percentage point of that out of this 2.5%. So about half of the people who want to leave actually would want to stay if Russia were less corrupt. So another thing which I would like to mention is not how corruption hits Russia today, but what kind of long-term problems it creates. One big issue is, of course, business climate and investment climate. When I mention this money taken offshore, it's not just the money which corrupts Dutch banks, or it's also money that could have been invested in Russia. And we are talking about something like 4% of GDP a year, which is taken out of Russia on average in recent, say, 5 years, but also in recent 20 years. And that is, again, something that could have brought faster economic growth in Russia, could have actually raised investment to GDP ratios, could bring new technology to Russia, but it's not. So another issue is, of course, corruption is creating inequality, and inequality is something which is very hard to fight in the short run. So when Russia becomes cleaner, it will take some time to overcome this inequality, especially inequality of opportunity. So in Russia, inequality of income is not that high. So in Russia, Gini coefficient, depends which sources you trust, is 35 to 40. 40 is kind of US level or Chinese level. So Russia, in terms of income inequality, is not very unequal. But Russia is very unequal in terms of inequality of opportunity. So large part of this income inequality is actually dictated by circumstances of birth, gender, parental background. And so this is something you cannot change. If you are born in a wrong family, and if you have wrong gender, and Russia still has a huge gender gap, and if you're born in the wrong place, then you're less likely to make it to the top in Russia, which is something that doesn't surprise us. But what I think is striking is the very specific measure of inequality of opportunity, which is wealth inequality. So according to different sources, Russia is most unequal country in terms of wealth distribution. According to the Global Wealth Report, top 1% of Russians own 55% of all wealth in Russia. In a country like Netherlands or France, the number would be 20%. Still a lot, but not comparable. Top 10% of Russians own 82% of Russian wealth. So when I was talking about this offshore wealth taken out of Russia, this $1 trillion that is sitting in some countries, and I'll mention one particular country later on, this total wealth is more likely than not to be owned by top 1% or maybe top 10%. So this is a huge number. Why is that? The problem is that if you have a corrupt system, if you cannot trust courts, if you cannot trust bureaucrats, it creates what we call institutional economies of scale. People who are bigger have preferential treatment, preferential access to justice. I call it justice in quotes because it isn't really not justice. The idea of justice is that everybody is treated equally. But in Russia, if you're bigger, of course, you have better political connections. Your political connections go to higher level, and you have easier time to bribe the courts and the media and the political parties. And that means you become even bigger. Now, we also have inequality in the West, and I'm happy to talk about this, also something that I teach and do research on. But corruption in Russia is something which drives this wealth inequality, creates oligarchs, creates super rich government officials whose wealth is not recorded by Forbes magazine, but still we know it's very high. Now, what we did at the BRD, we actually looked at the biggest businesses in different countries, and we tried to see where the richest people made their money. Now, two facts stand out. First, post-communist region, and Russia in particular, are disproportionately overrepresented in the list of global billionaires. So Russia and post-communist region as a whole, but mostly Russia, has more billionaires than it was supposed to have, given that Russia is actually an economy which is only 1.5 times bigger than Netherlands. So Russian billionaires, as I said, own a big chunk of Russian wealth. But what is even more striking is that in Russia and in many post-communist countries, billionaires make their wealth in specific industries, which are natural resources and regulated industries. In the rest of the world, in advanced economies and in emerging markets, billionaires usually are not getting rich from natural resources because natural resources are taxed everywhere. They are not getting rich from regulated industries, with some exceptions, because governments are usually good in making sure that people who are regulated by them don't become super rich. And so a lot of wealth is made in retail, in services, well, some in finance, some in entertainment, and some in IT. But Russia stands out as a country where billionaires get rich because of their connections to government. And one other long-term implication of the status quo in Russia is, of course, the fact that Russians distrust market reforms. Russians distrust market economy. And this is something, again, that I did research on. We show that those people who see corruption in their everyday life, they're more likely to say, I distrust democracy and I distrust markets. So the next question is, if corruption is so costly, why won't government not fight it? Why won't government want to solve the problem? So there are two answers to this question. One is they don't know how to do it. The other one is they don't want to fight it, right? And so a lot of people will tell you that Russia has always been corrupt. You cannot solve this problem in Russia. It's never going to be clean because it's never been clean. This is, of course, wrong because all countries which are clean today used to be corrupt. And we've seen examples, very strong examples of transformation. And one of the countries which went this way was Georgia, which became much cleaner just over the course of 10 years. And that was actually happening in front of Mr. Putin and Mr. Medvedev's government. And yet they were closing their eyes to that. Even today, Ukraine, which is culturally very similar to Russia and very corrupt, is undertaking many reforms which Russia doesn't want to undertake. I personally, again, feel very strongly about this because in 2012, I was part of an effort called Open Government in Russia, and we prepared a report on how to fight corruption, where we borrowed best global practices from countries like Georgia or Singapore, and we were bluntly rejected. So we made a presentation. Some of that presentation was actually censored, so some of the things we were not able to say, and some of the things we said, but they were never used. And solutions exist. Some of those solutions are implemented in Russia. There are pockets of meritocracy in Russian bureaucracy. Some government services are provided through digital means with limited corruption. There is also an improvement in what's called doing business rankings by the World Bank, where Russia has improved certain services for businesses. But overall, of course, as I said, Russia remains a very corrupt country, not because solutions don't exist, and not because Russian government doesn't know about those solutions. I was part of a group of people who tried to tell Russian government, actually did tell Russian government what to do. But as I mentioned before, Mr. Putin and Mr. Medvedev were busy doing other things. So next question is, if for personal reasons you know that you have to have several policies, does that mean that you cannot fight corruption? Well, in this country, there is a queen who has policies, and yet the country is clean. So what is a problem here? So can you actually be corrupt yourself, but clean out the rest of the bureaucracy? And here, there is not a personal or psychological problem that you have to have more palaces than English queen or Dutch queen. This is not just this urge to consume coming from Soviet Union, where you had very limited housing. So this is also a structural problem. The system in Russia is built in the way where corruption is an important tool of running the country. The reason for that is Russia is, as we call it with my co-author Daniel Treisman, an informational autocracy. Russia is not a democracy, but Russia is not also a dictatorship of 20th century. In Russia, there are political prisoners, but there are hundreds of them. People don't get executed en masse, like they would be in Stalin's years. But the idea is that even though elections are held, elections cannot be lost by the government. And the way to do it is not to be feared, but to be popular. But then, of course, Russia is a very educated country, and many people understand what's going on. What I'm telling you, it would be not news to tens of percents of Russian people. There are many smart people, and so they have to be silenced. The way you silence people is either you censor what they get to say, or sometimes you put them in jail for a short or long time, or you co-opt them. And so there are many smart people who are completely aware of what I'm saying, yet they don't want to fight the regime because the regime is bribing them. And then the question is, can you actually co-opt people without corruption? Can I give you a nice way to earn money in a legal way? And the answer is no. I want to co-opt you in the way where you know that you owe it to me, that is not deserved by you. So it has to be somehow questionable. So you're on the hook. You depend on me. And so corruption as a cooptation device of the elites is a very important part of the game. And so that's why corruption is not going to disappear. And now the main battleground is, of course, media, and most importantly, online media. And I have a paper which shows that internet does communicate facts about corruption as long as it's not censored. And so I'm happy to talk about that research as well. It's not just Russia, it's around the world, where autocrats try to fight internet because internet delivers critical messages. And some governments do it very effectively by censoring internet, and this is one of the battlegrounds today. Now let me, for the sake of being brief, talk about the role of the West. So one big feature of Russian society is Russia is a European country, and Russian elite gets co-opted not in order to move to Venezuela or China or North Korea. They want to save their money here in Europe. They want to send their kids to schools in the West. They don't want to be staying in Russia. Why? Because they know the system is not sustainable. They know economic growth is not there. They know this is not going to end well. And by the time things end there, they want to be away in a nice place, which is Europe. And this is where the challenge is. So they store this $1 trillion offshore, and the question is where? And interestingly enough, this is not a random place. So you hear a lot about London, you hear a lot about Miami, but actually Netherlands is a number 2 destination in many statistics. So number 1 is Cyprus, and Netherlands is number 2. So if you look at FDI from Russia to abroad, Cyprus is a destination for $200 billion accumulated. The stock of investment from Russia to Cyprus is 200 billion. Netherlands is like 60. Luxembourg is 18. Switzerland is also 20, right? So Switzerland and Luxembourg are close thirds. And then such small countries as Germany, France, and UK are far behind. Now, if you think about investment from the West to Russia, most investment is coming from Cyprus. You can imagine that Cyprus is not a huge economy. So Cyprus GDP is $20–25 billion, depends on the year since the crisis. Cyprus stock of investment to Russia is $145 billion. So if you think about that, you can kind of connect these numbers and see that some of this money is going like in that movie around the world. And Cyprus plays an important role. And Netherlands again comes second with 54 billion, and Luxembourg is a close third. Luxembourg is very close to Netherlands. And then Switzerland, France, UK, and Germany are kind of 3 times behind Luxembourg and Netherlands. So when we talk about investment to and from Russia, both numbers are in the range of $500 billion in those statistics, and Netherlands is accountable for 10% in both dimensions. So it's a huge, huge partner for some of the people discussed in that video. So why Netherlands? Well, if you think about Russian diaspora is of course in London, not here. But Russian companies get registered here. And of course, there are specific parts of Dutch legislation, zero tax rate for holding companies, not earning money in Netherlands. Quality of life is high, but as I said, these people don't live here. They mostly live in London. But the legislation is such that it seems to be more convenient to be here. Now, is that part of foreign policy by the Kremlin to be corrupting the Western elites and the Dutch elites in particular? Is what you've seen in the movie is part of the strategic plan to destroy the West? Yes and no. The most important goal of Russian regime is to stay in power, to make money and to spend it in Europe. And for that, they need a number of things to be communicated to Russians. One of them is whataboutism. Right? They need to say that, well, we are corrupt, but what about Europe? What about Berlusconi? Look at Netherlands. Our company is registered in Netherlands, so we must be clean. So this equivalence, moral equivalence argument that we may not be clean, but Cyprus is not clean and Cyprus is a member of the EU, or Luxembourg is a member of the EU. So why would you criticize us? And then, of course, they would give every example of a corrupt Western politician. That is part of the game. Now, another issue is, of course, that they want to undermine EU and they want to divide and rule. And this is something I'm sure will come up in the questions, because they think that they can play European countries against each other. And that is also important for the narrative that EU is in decline. And again, something that we can talk about, to what extent Putin comes up as a defender of true Europe, while modern Europe is a decadent Europe falling apart with too many freedoms and too much protections for minorities. At some point, of course, this money is used in foreign policy strategies. And this country is an example where looks like Putin's money were used in the referendum against Ukraine joining DCFTA, which is a very important part of Ukrainian 2014 revolution of dignity. The whole revolution was about integration with Europe. And once this revolution happened, integration into Europe, which has played a very important role for Ukrainian economy, economic growth, which is happening today, commitment to fighting corruption, and so. And so, luckily, this initiative didn't work, but this is an example where sometimes corrupt money is used to influence political decision-making in Western countries. So what to do? So if a Western politician asks me what to do, first and foremost, I would say, you have strong laws, enforce them. Apply the laws to corrupt individuals, no matter how influential and rich they look. You also need to tighten anti-corruption laws. You also need to introduce radical transparency in who owns what. This is finally coming up in London. So in London, we will soon know who owns which real estate. And so I guess that will bring some rich people to other Western countries moving out of London. But this is something that really works. Another dimension is, of course, individual sanctions against people who violate principles that Russia commits to. Because Russia is not a dictatorship. It does have a constitution. It does commit to principles of Council of Europe, and of course doesn't enforce them. And what Americans did in 2012, they introduced what's called Magnitsky Act. So if you violate human rights, your assets in the US can be frozen, and your visa to the US can be suspended. And so that infuriated Kremlin big time, and if there are questions, I can talk about this, but actually that became one of the major foreign policy objectives in Russia, to attack Magnitsky Act and to take it down. Instead, Magnitsky Act spread to other countries, and actually European Parliament asked member states to think about introducing it in individual member states. And some member states have actually introduced it. So these individual sanctions are very popular in Russia. So whoever hears about them and understands why they're introduced against corrupt individuals, the Russians, of course, just support it. And these corrupt individuals are, of course, running the country, so they get compensated by Russian budget at the expense of Russian taxpayers and pensioners. However, they still are unhappy because the cash they accumulate, they cannot put anywhere. The problem that they have is, if they're under sanctions, they cannot put this cash into the West. So can they put this money in Russian banks? No, because they fight each other. And the moment, and these are true stories, the moment you take your couple of million of dollars to a Russian bank to put it on your bank account, since the bank clerk is paid off by other KGB general, the team of KGB officers comes in, grabs the dollars, actually never returns it to the government, and runs away with the dollars. So what you can also do, you can buy an apartment and store your dollars in an apartment in cash. And this is also a true story. The person who was in KGB monitoring the bank fraud was arrested, and they found something like $150 million in cash in his apartment. Another KGB general was so desperate, he actually dug a hole in his courtyard and buried there $5 million. And then organized crime figured out that that must be the case. They tortured him to tell them where exactly this container with the dollars is. He gave up, gave them the cash, and then they were caught by another part of the KGB. And so they both denied that they've ever seen this money. So life of these people is not easy. But they try hard, and there are people in the West who help them. Lawyers, bankers, public relations consultants, political consultants. And these people, sometimes real estate agents, sometimes these people do everything legally, but they have to be exposed and shamed. Some of these people break Dutch or English laws. Some of them don't, but they should be named and shamed, because what they do, these Western citizens know that they help a regime which is corrupt and non-democratic. Finally, if there is a politician from a member state, I would say support Europe, support Council of Europe, support European Court for Human Rights. This is, by Russian law, European Court of Human Rights is the top legal authority. So the decisions made by European Court of Human Rights is actually above any other court in Russia. And so this is the only rule of law, the only source of justice Russian politicians can have. Another thing which the West should do is to support reforms and anti-corruption fight in Ukraine. Ukraine remains a very corrupt country, but it does many right things. And success in Ukraine destroys the argument that there should be no anti-corruption successes in Russia. This narrative should be undermined, and it will be undermined if Ukraine succeeds. Finally, since this is an informational dictatorship, informational autocracy, the battleground is information. So Europe should fight disinformation and Russian propaganda. Europe should try to project its own soft power by bringing in Russian people to Europe, especially students, by facilitating access to European visas, or maybe actually going even further to lengthening visa horizon, or maybe going visa-free, to make sure that people who are not corrupt can enter Europe, people who are not sanctioned can enter Europe and see that Europe is not falling apart, and it actually functions better than Russian TV tells you. I also promised that I will say something very important about Raam of Rusland. Why? Because I think this is a very important activity, that's very important work. You need to understand what's going on in Russia. Russian propaganda is very sophisticated, it's much better than it used to be, and its impact, especially on conservative voters, is very effective. And so studying Russia, understanding how Russia works, is important. Russia is not going to disappear. It's a declining power, but it's still a huge country, and it will continue to be the neighbor of Europe, and it will continue until it democratizes, be against European values. And understanding how exactly Russia does, or Russian regime does what it does, is important, and so I salute Raam of Rusland for this. And finally, to end on the optimistic note, there is no need to panic. So Russian regime doesn't have an attractive model. Dutch citizens don't run to Russia. Chinese don't relocate to Russia. There was a famous French actor, Gérard Depardieu, who did move to Russia, got 2 pieces of real estate, sold them, and moved back. And people don't really know that, but he no longer lives there. And that is important, that Russia is not something which can communicate an attractive future. Soviet Union had an ideology. Russian ideology pretty much doesn't exist. And in that sense, I remain optimistic because, on one hand, Russia is attached to Europe. If you ask Russian people about their knowledge of Chinese poetry, they would blank. They would know a lot about European culture, European history. They think about themselves as European. And of course, Russia's never been a democracy, but most democratic European countries, before they became democracies, also were not a democracy. And in that sense, proximity to Europe will eventually help. And even though Russia is corrupt today, examples of other countries, as I mentioned, show that this battle can be won and actually will be won. And so let me stop here on this optimistic note.
Thank you. Please sit. Please. Thank you very much for that great introduction to the evening. Let me start by saying something about the evening. There will be no break, so you can prepare in your mind for no break. And after a few questions, we will introduce the other guest and have a discussion with the 2 gentlemen together, and there will be time for questions. So don't worry, I will come to you if you have a question. So thank you, Mr. Guriev, that was really interesting. And you ended on this optimistic note about the Russian model not being an attractive model. And at the beginning you mentioned how many people saw the video about Medvedev and the palaces he owns and everything. You mentioned 30 million, if I'm correct.
32?
Yeah, 32.
Yeah.
And so this is a source of information for ordinary Russians, maybe. But does this undermine the legitimacy of the Putin regime? Does this have an effect in that way?
That is a very important problem for Putin regime. Russian courts actually ordered to take this video down. And there are a couple of criminal cases of people involved in the production of the video. And one of them actually ran away from Russia. The video is still on. You can still watch it. It, of course, has English subtitles, and it's just a great video. So creatively, I applaud the team. But yes, this video made a big impact exactly because Mr. Medvedev is not supposed to be the most important Russian policymaker, even though he is a prime minister. But even he has 7 palaces. So you start asking questions. The people who are supposedly more influential, how much money they have. And then, of course, the other problem is that these videos are going through YouTube. And so Russian government now is losing the battle of TV versus YouTube. Will this drive Russian governments to some action against YouTube? And so this is something that will remain the biggest question. So Russian government launched a war against Telegram, which is a messenger. And in Russia, it actually plays a role of social network because you can create channels and create pretty much your own online media.
You can broadcast.
You can kind of broadcast,
yeah, okay.
And some of those channels have 50 or 100,000 subscribers. And so this technology, the Telegram messenger, was actually built by a person who was a competitor to Facebook in Russia, was forced out of Russia, sold the VK, the social network in Russia, and built the Telegram from scratch here in Europe. And the Russian government outlawed Telegram and then lost. Telegram continues to function.
Oh, really?
So on YouTube, the war is not yet fully launched, but I also think that it's not clear whether the Russian government will succeed because the goal of Russian government is to project this image that the government is popular, and only a small minority criticizes the government. There are 2 problems here. One is this minority is growing, so 30 million is not a small minority anymore. And of course, if you watch the video, you don't necessarily think you need to go and protest, but still, it's an important message. But then another important issue is for the rest. You want to project an image that the regime is democratic and popular and loved, and there is no repression. And once you shut down YouTube and people from the majority will not be able to watch funny cat videos or beauty bloggers, they will start suspecting that something is wrong. So this becomes a very important battleground, and I think we are going to see something happening.
Yeah, so it could alarm more people.
Exactly.
Yeah. And so you also mentioned very briefly that Sberbank, which you were part of once, bought the Troika dialogue, the investment bank we saw in the video in the beginning. And so I wanted to ask you, when did you know at that time that these things were going on? Because you were high advising the government, you were in the banks. Did you see it at that time? We are talking 2012?
Yeah, so acquisition was in 2012. What is reported in the video actually was happening probably since 2007, 8, 9. And rumors were abound. And so Troika was both a healthy investment bank, which was probably too optimistic and therefore too much in debt because of the crisis, during the crisis, but also a number of deals which are exposed here. And so what Sberbank did, they said, this part of Troika business we don't touch. And yet, I think what Mr. Vardanyan is saying in this video, saying that what I did was legal then, is also true. Fortunately, the standards have tightened. This is something that I mentioned. International financial community is becoming tighter, stricter on things
so
like
the
this.
Rules since then have
rules
changed.
have changed and improved.
Yeah.
And
okay.
what is illegal today was actually perfectly legal, even though unethical at that point.
Yeah.
And so this is what happened. And this is what Mr. Vardanyan would tell you. He would say, well, there was this governor or this cellist, and my client told me to send this amount of money to the governor's relative or to the cellist. And I had to comply. it was not illegal, and my client would tell me to do that. And of course, at that point, of course, everybody would understand that the 80-year-old grandmother of governor is not providing brilliant services to this
for
client.
that amount of money
Exactly.
to be transferred
Exactly.
to her. Yeah. And when did you become aware that this level of corruption was going on?
So for me, the biggest revelation was Panama Papers. So Panama Papers teaches you two things. One is that once you believe that Mr. Raldugin represents Mr. Putin's interest, which seems to be the consensus now, you start to figure out how much money is involved in those transactions. And some people would say, well, 10 years ago, one journalist said, well, Mr. Putin is worth $40 billion. By now, I think this number is of a completely different magnitude, probably from what we know in Panama Papers. But another thing is also not how much money Mr. Raldugin.
This is the cellist.
The cellist,
yeah,
yes.
who is a friend.
Yeah,
of
yeah.
Putin.
The fact that you don't know this name suggests that he is not an impressive businessman. At this point,
No.
right? So the fact that Mr. Raldugin was getting payment here, payment there, sometimes the payment would be 200 million, sometimes the payment would be several thousand. And actually that means for every decision made by Russian political leadership, you have to make a payment to Mr. Raldugin. Sometimes decision is small, so the payment is small. 200 million payment was a bailout of a big bank or a change in the leadership of a region of Russia. So you can connect those payments to various political decisions made. But what is striking is that in addition to those hundreds of millions you care about, you also care about small amounts. So there is a whole system of payments, price tags, and so on. And this is, of course, is very interesting. This is not something that I was aware of.
No, no. And just one more personal question before we go to the next guest. You left Russia in 2013 because you did not feel safe there anymore, and you still don't feel safe to go to Russia.
So I worked at the EBRD as a EBRD employee. I had diplomatic immunity. And under diplomatic immunity, I could go to Russia. Now I don't feel it's safe for me to go to Russia.
And why don't you feel safe? You are too critical?
Well, when I was at the EBRD, I was not too critical. But
you had
honestly, there are several things that may make Russian government unhappy about an individual. So one is support of Mr. Navalny, who is, of course, the most important politician in the Russian opposition and most unliked by the regime. The other one is support of Mr. Khodorkovsky, who is, again, one of the Putin's least loved oligarchs now residing in London. And third, direct criticism of Russian political system. So I did all of those.
Yeah, and that made you unpopular. Okay, that's very clear. So please, I would like to invite our other speaker, Mr. Paul Tang. He is a member of the European Parliament. You can give him an applause. And ga ik in het midden, ja? He's already taking over. Oh, thank you. So, member of European Parliament for the Dutch Social Democrats, the PvdA. He used to also be in the Dutch Parliament, and he used to, before that, a long time ago, you just told me, work at the Ministry of Economic Affairs in the Netherlands. You are very involved in the European Parliament into tax avoidance and laws to prevent that. And also you did something that was quite unpopular here in Holland. You made the European Parliament say that we are a tax haven.
Yeah.
Yes. Why?
Well, we are. This is a problem with we like to think kindly of ourselves. We have a good self-image, and I suppose that's good psychology. But we think we are well-organized, orderly, punctual people, and that the rest of the world is not like us. But of course, it's a dent in our image that we are one of the enablers for tax avoiding, for hiding wealth from corruption. So we are enabling tax avoidance and corruption. There are a few of the hubs in the network in this world We have already heard Luxembourg and the Netherlands, but of course it's countries like Singapore, Switzerland, a bit of Cyprus, but that's not the major. It's mainly Russian money in Cyprus. So we are huge in it. So we think of ourselves as a very small country, but we are pretty brilliant in this.
And what
so
do we do?
This is not far away, by the way. It's in Zuidas, where are the lawyers and the tax advisors. So it's nearby. You could organize a tour, by the way, of all the Russian affiliates here in Amsterdam. It would be a brilliant tour. It brings you to the south and to the center, to the beautiful places in Amsterdam, where they have their branches and their affiliates.
And what do we do? What is so special about Holland?
I think someone explained to me at one point, and this is where I realized I'm an economist by training, that the law of says that supply creates its own demand. And I sort of hate that law as an economist because I don't think it's very much true. But in this case, it is true. We are really good at it. So we have this infrastructure here of lawyers and fiscal advisors that allows you to move your money around. Just to one number, and I just was presented by the IMF early September. And well, let's say two facts. First of all, they decide, so what is phantom investment? So that is investment that is not associated with any real activity, not with a factory, not even with an office, just for the purpose of distracting authorities. This is a huge amount, and Luxembourg and the Netherlands attract half of this phantom investment, according to the IMF. Now, if you look at the statistics of the Netherlands, it's really fascinating. There's something odd going on. We have a lot of foreign direct investment here. It's huge. Luxembourg is the same. Luxembourg has the same foreign direct investment as the US. To give you an example. So we have 600,000 people in Luxembourg, we have 250 million Americans, and they have the same incoming foreign
money
direct investment.
flows.
Yeah. Now, and the Netherlands has almost incoming foreign direct investment of 4 trillion. Now, I'm an economist, but I still have to think about 4 trillion. What is that?
Yeah, it's unimaginable.
It's sort
GDP for 4 years of Netherlands. Huh?
Yeah, I think so. We have a pension wealth. I think we have a pension wealth of 1,600 billion. Mm-hmm. I think it's 2.5 times the Dutch pension wealth. That's what occurred to me in the train. Mm-hmm. So we think we have a well-funded pension system. Well, that's one of the discussions we have. But all the incoming foreign direct investment is much more than the pension wealth that Holland has.
And it doesn't all stay here. It also flows through
we
other places where the money can.
It's a bit like the Rotterdam Harbor. We transport it through. So it's in all this the Dutch tradition.
It's a trade nation.
Yeah, we're a trade nation. Absolutely. Yes. And we're happy to have the trade also from Russia because that's booming business, right? The numbers I saw were slightly different. So, but it has more than become 6 times as much as 10 years ago. So Russia is good business for, the lawyers in Amsterdam here.
Yeah, and so this money that flows through the Netherlands, or to the Netherlands, that you are talking about, is also money from Western multinationals that try to optimize their tax payments. That is a nice way of saying
That's
it.
Absolutely
but
beautiful. You could work in the sector.
It can also be used for people from countries like Russia or Ukraine that would like to hide money or not be the real owner of money, or not show that they are the real owner of money. So these two flows, they interchange and they use the same structures. Yeah,
absolutely. Because what you need, what I realized at one point, is that globalization is partly legal. It allows you have to have your affiliates, your branches everywhere in the world. So if you look at all this type of transaction, if it's the laundromat, it's a cascade of firms and flowing, which is nearly impossible to track. That's one of the key features of this type of construction.
And so, if you listen to Mr. Guriev's story and his analysis of the corruption in Russia and the role of the Dutch, is that something that you were aware of? Is it relatively new that it has this?
Well, my first reaction is, of course, I'm glad that the Dutch is not a corrupt country because it is toxic to the economy and the society, and that's the impression I have. However, the fact that we are not a corrupt country doesn't make us sensitive to that we enable corruption. So I think we have been far too lenient in this, and that's the second reason we don't want to destroy our good self-image. That's the first reason. We don't want to hear this message that we are not just exporting tulips and cheese, but also dirty financial products, so to say. But this is also one of the issues that we are not sensitive to corruption and that we enable it. And that has to do very much, you mentioned it already, if you see what the Dutch banks, well, didn't do, so to say, they have a crucial role. They are the gatekeeper of the system. Because part of any construction, there are financial transactions. So they are crucial in fighting, let's say, illegal money flows.
They have to be some sort of policeman over money that flows.
They are the
banks.
first to report.
Yeah.
So they give us the information, they provide us the information, the data, and they have to be better good at it. Well, we now have the two major banks in the Netherlands,
ING and ABN, yeah.
And they have, it's clear that they haven't done their job. In fact, on the day that it was clear that ING had to pay 775 million, I was talking with a representative from the ING. He says, yeah, but Paul, we know we want to invest in it, but what is the use of it? Why would we do that? That was the culture at that point still, and I very much hope they learn a lesson, because this is crucial if you want to fight tax avoidance, corruption, illegal money.
They have to hire people to monitor the money flows, and those people don't earn money, they cost money. That's their view. Okay. So, Mr. Guriev, do you think, if you look at all the things you just sketched, that Europe, the European Union, the financial watchdogs, all the laws that are in place, you said we have strict laws, so that Europe is doing enough to stop this, to stop the enablement?
Well, judging by what we've just discussed, not enough. But Europe is crucial here, because if you think about a small country with very big banks, it's very hard to regulate an outsized bank. Let's not take a Dutch example, but say Switzerland has also big banks, CS and UBS. And it's very hard to attack an outsized financial institution. Europe can do that through cross-border regulation. And in that sense, there is hope, because, of course, European policymakers compete with each other. French bankers don't like Dutch bankers. They will try to lobby ECB. They will try to lobby other enforcement institutions. And so Europe, by construction, has tools to eventually address this problem.
Yeah, but they are not doing enough now.
Not yet, not yet. But again, the scandals that we know about, these are the scandals which are being investigated. They are not hidden under the rug. People go to jail already, and so in that sense, we should give credit where credit is due. So these things are not hidden. They're being disclosed and investigated.
Mr. Tang, in the spring, the European Parliament asked or demanded a plan from the European Commission, the new European Commission, for a financial watchdog that would, even an EU financial police force that would look into money laundering and corruption. But when the new European Commission started just recently, I read almost nothing in the plans.
Good point. You remind me that. It's a good point.
Of Ursula von der Leyen, who just is heading the European Commission.
No, and that is, and I think the European Parliament is keen to have this. To give credit, I think we have made important changes. Sergei rightly emphasized that we need to know who owns what. In the example in the video, you see someone who is totally unaware is all of a sudden an owner. He doesn't even know his signature is under the agreement. So it's difficult to find out who owns what, but it's crucial if you want to fight it. Now this has been introduced in the European Union, I think in 2015. It's now implemented in 2017 in the Netherlands and other countries as well.
So you have to disclose the real owner of a company.
So that's an important change.
So you cannot have
that's
a shell company anymore.
That's the idea, of course. Now, so I often ask, what do we need to improve still in lawmaking? And the answer is, no, it's not just that we need to make laws, we need to implement them laws. So we are on the way, so to say. But there's one element that is crucial. And that's also pointed out by, for example, ING, and it's right. If there's a suspect firm, the bank needs to block the transfer and not accept this firm as a client. But it cannot share this information with others.
Other banks. Yeah.
Other banks. And that would make sense, right? If you know there's a bad guy out there, this bad guy can get to the next door and they can say yes.
Knows, yeah.
So sharing information is important for investigation. So what you would like to have is a Europol, for example, could be a possibility where you at least can investigate and exchange information. So that's one. The second thing is that you need to prosecute as well, because globalization is crossing, money is crossing borders, but our legal systems are all national. Now this is a change that the Netherlands is barely making. So for the first time we have a European prosecution allowed by the Netherlands. But I think it's crucial if you want to fight international crime, if you want to fight international money constructions like this, you need to also have European prosecution. So these are the changes that are still due, and that's what we fight for, and European Parliament sees this point. But then you come back to the usually European countries. Oh yes, we think Europe is fine, but we want to do it ourselves. That's the attitude of many member states. So that's the usual tension that we have in the European Union.
And the question is,
usually that takes some years, but we will overcome it.
And the question is, do they really want to do it? Because countries earn money by enabling.
Well, that's the stupid thing. Like I said, we have a lot of wealth hidden here or going through here. It would make sense if we would earn money from that. But we're too stupid to earn money from that. It's just the lawyers and the tax advisors. Really, now it's not that we tax it here. Now the point is that it comes here because we don't tax it, right? So that's part of the deal here. So it only goes through Holland because it's not taxed.
So the Dutch government, the recent government, Rutte 3, has taken some measures to sort of make the flow of money through Holland smaller. Do you think that's enough?
No, that will not be enough, but I like every move in that direction. So let's be optimistic, right? So
let's be optimistic. That's very good.
Because what if the thing is all the shell companies we still like? It's more that don't forget it's the infrastructure. If you're good at it, we're not going to lose our competitive advantage overnight.
Yeah. So, Mr. Guriev, I also wanted to ask you about a British journalist, Oliver Ballow, wrote a book, Moneyland. I read it, I was impressed by it, because he not only sketches these money flows and the money laundering, but also what money can buy if you are rich enough. It can buy you diplomatic immunity in some small countries in the world, or even passports in Malta. If you pay 900,000.
Not just in Malta, many countries.
But elsewhere in Europe also?
In the UK. In the UK.
In the UK, how much money do you need to pay in the UK?
I don't know. I've not been to this market, but I think we're talking about 1 million or 2 million.
And in Malta,
investor visa, it's called.
It's 900,000 euros. Yeah. How worrisome is that development?
I think it is very worrisome, and I think, as I mentioned, one of the useful features of the system in Europe, useful for Russia, is that many politicians feel that they're underpaid. And it's striking to Russian oligarchs how little money you have to pay to buy a Western politician. We are not talking about enablers like taxes and tax advisors or bankers and so on, but sometimes politicians are happy to work. For Russia, it's little money, $1 million a year. Mr. Schröder was paying.
And what politicians?
Mr.
Schröder, he worked.
So I'm not giving other names, but this is probably the most.
He's well known, right?
Yes, he's well known, and for Russia, $1 million is a huge amount of money for a Russian teacher, but for a Russian bureaucrat, it's not. So if you actually look at yachts, if you look at parties, you see that $1 million is not much money, and so I think. In this country, you would believe that politicians are honest, but there are many other countries where politicians feel they're underpaid. And I think there should be a clear system where politicians, after finishing their career, or even during their career, understand that they're not looking for payments. They have higher good to deliver, something like this. I think this is a very important part of the equation. And Russian government honestly believes that it is corrupt, but other governments are also corrupt.
And so they appoint these people like Mr. Schröder to give it a veneer of respectability. What is the reason?
Not just that, but also influence decisions, right? So I'll give you another example, since we are talking about Dutch socialist Democrats. There is the Spitzenkandidat from that party, Frans Timmermans. And Frans Timmermans was blocked by certain European countries. Why? Because he was in charge of rule of law in the previous commission. And those countries, as we understand now, are not committed to anti-corruption policies, to put it mildly. And this is where Russians are very happy to support those governments to fight against people like Mr. Timmermans in their work against corruption. So I used the word against many times, but this is how this battle continues. And so it's not just to gain credibility and become kind of more normal, more acceptable, but it's also influencing decisions.
Yeah,
and it's not just retired politicians, but also functioning politicians. So one of the stories is a story about Mr. Salvini, Mr. Savioni in Russia, where there was a recording about a deal worth something like $60 million. Again, something that Russian oil company can afford, but by Western political standards, that's too much. And so there was a discussion about an oil deal about Italy and Russia, where there would be a kickback that would be used by the Liga. And looks like this deal didn't go through. There is now an investigation in Italy about this. But of course, Russian government loves policies promoted by Mr. Salvini.
yes.
And so they would like to support politicians like Mr. Salvini.
Yeah.
And so this happened not when Mr. Salvini was out of the government. This happened when he was in the government, Minister of the Interior, and a very important European politician. And there is also another journalistic investigation which suggests that his Russia hand was traveling to Moscow and back something like 20 times a year in a private jet, and there is a lot of debate what he was actually carrying from Moscow.
So in this way, it can corrupt here as well.
It can corrupt the system now.
Yeah.
Paul says that this government, this country, this society believes it's clean, but there are some other countries which are corruptible.
Yeah, and that will serve one of the goals you just said of the Russian government, maybe to divide Europe, to
Absolutely.
undermine Europe.
Absolutely.
In a way.
So
yeah.
an example, Mr. Timmermans' agenda of reconfirming rule of law in Europe was actually fought by specific countries, in this case Hungary and Poland, Poland doesn't like Russia and Russia doesn't like Poland, but Hungarian government is a big fan of Russian government.
Yeah.
And there are many deals between the two.
Do you experience this kind of Russian influence in European politics, as Mr. Guriev sketches?
I deny that I was offered anything. I don't know.
But it's very worrying.
Yeah, no, of course, and there are more stories about. Also, Le Pen, Front National, was funded by Russian money. We have Russians spending on, I think it was a nuclear plant in Hungary. So we are well aware of the money of the examples of money flows, because we don't know all the flows. And of course, we know, if we look at social media, that it is very active. And that's one of the major concerns. So in the European Parliament, my colleague Kati Peri also started and tried to have a committee on the foreign influences on elections. Because that's one of the issues that you see in many countries, and that we have to take under investigation and also find a way to defend ourselves, because it's very clear that the influence is there. We don't know what the effect actually is, but it should be worrying if you would like to have free, independent media, and not the influence through social media from abroad, and especially not from.
Yeah, you suspect that there is influence and that there are things happening.
No,
but
we
you
know
don't know exactly
we
where.
don't know what the effect is. What is the effect on the use of social media? What has been the effect on the Brexit campaign? What has been the effect in the election of Trump? We don't know for sure, of course, but we know there has been very suspicious. I think this has been well documented suspicious activity. It seems to have a great reach. Then again, the effect of social media on voting behavior. All right.
In European politics, are there stromingen, how do I say that, that are on your side and others that are not helping, that are resisting, maybe because
Brexit party is...
Brexit, yes.
But they say just leave us, so leave us alone, so that's...
Never know.
No, I think there's generally the concern about the effect on our democracy. Right, so I think that's a general concern. But in the European Parliament, we have every political flavor that you can think of, and the populist has also a very strong representation. As the example, Matteo Salvini started in the European Parliament, by the way.
Yeah.
And they usually use this European Parliament as a starting point, and then hope to jump back to their home. So many of those people are there as well.
Yeah, quite worrisome picture here. I would like to go to the audience because we don't have a lot of time. Oh, I see already. Oh, yes. A lot of people want to ask a question. I would kindly beg you, a question is not a speech. It has a question mark at the end of it, so please keep it short. And if we can start here, I think you need to move to somewhere or somebody's coming to you. Yeah. So could you stand up and please say your name? And ask the question.
Yeah, so is this on? Hello. My name is Scott. I'm American. I've lived here for 2 years. So I want to say thank you for mentioning Moneyland by Oliver Bullough. Really good book, by the way, if you guys want to know a little bit more about that. So it's 2 questions, but each of them is short, I think.
Okay.
The title of the lecture is Russia's Corruption and Western Responsibility. So I find that kind of funny because the Western world and Russia hasn't exactly had the greatest relationship in the last 70 years. What are the Russian people's responsibility in all this? Because that wasn't really mentioned. The second thing is, it's more a question for, I think for you. This was mentioned a lot about Russians, the Russian government kind of dividing Europe. Why do you think it's been so easy to do that? So being American, I can say why. Culturally, we were already at a point where I think things were about to tip over. And Russia interfering in the 2016 election was just a little bit of a nudge. But what is it about Europe? Like, what's the underlying problem with Europe that makes it so easy for the Russians to interfere and drive that wedge?
Thank you. 2 very clear questions. Mr. Guriev.
So I'll take the first question, and I think, yes, Russian people have a responsibility. And I think it is not easy to fight corruption while you're in Russia, and some people end up in jail for fighting corruption. Right now, the Anti-Corruption Foundation, founded by Mr. Navalny, to which I was one of the founding donors in 2012, and that's why I'm speaking to you here. This foundation is now under major harassment effort. So in tens of its offices throughout the country, people are harassed, searched, their bank accounts are blocked, personal bank accounts are blocked. So these people cannot go and buy food in the shop. And so that is money laundering case, which is of course completely made up. And if you want to just Google, the whole idea of this money laundering case was completely made up and cooked up by Russian authorities. So yet, I think Russian people are responsible for not being able to kick out this particular corrupt and non-democratic regime. And I personally, I feel responsible. I've never voted for Mr. Putin, but I feel responsible that because of our failure to make Russia a peaceful and democratic country, people in the neighboring country died in many numbers, in great numbers. So I fully accept the responsibility.
Should I?
Mr. Tang.
Just quickly, and
wasn't Europe already easy to divide? It wasn't the Russians.
I'm not
the Russians just had to do this.
I agree in the sense that it was easier to divide the Anglo-Saxon country where the division and inequality was already larger than in Europe. I think the answer in short is that we have seen a discontent in our societies, bringing also to the front to the populist parties, and this is what the Russians try to use to fuel this discontent and to contribute to the rise of these parties. That I think that's in short, and then brings us to the question: why do we have this discontent? But we do that afterwards.
Okay, I saw more hands. Yeah, I think I saw you. Could you stand up? And there will be, yeah. Okay.
You can also collect questions if you want.
Oh yeah, collects. Yeah, I always forget them, but maybe you are
writing
better
down.
at this.
Oh, yeah.
You're writing down. Okay.
It's a question directed to Mr. Guriev. I'm Sherzad, and like you mentioned how a lot of Russian people are disappointed with free market, and from my own experience, it seems that government tries to present income inequality, formation of monopolies, or expansion of oligarchs as a necessary evil that comes with capitalism. And can you please tell, and unfortunately, these claims have some empirical evidence to them, but do you think it is possible to have inclusive growth in Russia without, all those downsides that come with free market?
Yes, I think it's a great question, and indeed, 1990s transition generated wealth inequality and corruption, and part of that is responsibility of reformers who both didn't think enough about those issues and in some cases profited themselves. And so this is very unfortunate. Now, can you create an inclusive growth model in a country like Russia? I think you can. It is harder to do in a country which is so unequal in many dimensions and is also resource rich, so you can have this resource rent easily appropriated. But there are other post-communist countries that have done reasonably well. Even within former Soviet Union, if you take Baltic countries out, because they're not truly, some countries, including the United States, have never recognized them as part of Soviet Union, actually. But within Soviet Union, you see major successes in some places. I mentioned Georgia. Georgia has lots of problems, and some mistakes made exactly in the dimension of inequality cost a lot to the reformers, but still, you can see successes. And of course, in Central Europe, you have countries which have gone through the transition, joined the EU, built reasonably inclusive market economy.
And isn't the essence of what you sketched about the corruption that all this money that is taken offshore is not invested in education, not invested in better roads, better hospitals, better whatever in the country itself to be able to have good growth?
Exactly.
Yeah.
So for every ruble which Russians have within the country, there is a ruble or a dollar. For every ruble you have within the country, you have a ruble outside of the country. Half of Russian wealth is outside. Think about this. And again, out of rubles within the country, many of them are also owned by people who don't want to invest in Russia.
Yeah, so that's the problem. And in follow-up to the American guy's question, I'm sorry, I don't know remember your name. Is
Scott.
Scott, okay, Scott. Is it possible? You are very good at this. Is it
take your notes.
Is it possible to be in business in Russia and not be corrupt?
So, in some industries,
let's ask.
it's probably impossible. And so, the business that was discussed in the case of this movie, investment banking, especially asset management. Either you are part of this game, helping rich people to invest their money, or your market is much smaller. And so in some industries, you can build a clean company. And so Russian IT sector used to be reasonably clean. Some Russian retail companies were reasonably clean and loved by Western investors for this, I should say. But in some industries, it's almost impossible.
Okay, thank you. If there's anybody upstairs who wants to ask a question, you have to come downstairs. Okay. Yes, this sir here with the beautiful gray hair. Could you stand up, sir?
My name is George Kate. I recently learned about Reuters having a subsidiary especially focused on disclosing global money laundering systems by algorithms, investigation of algorithms and transactions. Are you familiar with this Reuters initiative? That's one question, and the second is, do you think that in this audience is someone from Kremlin here to overhear you?
Thank you. Mr. Guriev.
Very, very simple question. So first question, no, unfortunately, I'm not aware. I have great respect for Reuters, and I see some of the stories, probably they're driven by big data analysis. So I know many journalists from Reuters, and I respect them enormously. Some of the stuff you saw in the video was eventually brought up by Reuters, and I think actually both Bloomberg and Reuters have both skills and courage to write about those things, and it's a very important part of resisting non-democratic corrupt regimes. And so if you want to give money to Reuters, somehow give money to Reuters. But talking about the second question, Russian regime is no longer relying on human assets, as they would say, only. So they can listen to us without actually buying a whole ticket. Yeah.
But do you think they are listening?
I think for many recent years, I assume they always listen. And actually, I've seen court, and again, I would say court rulings that allow to monitor all my phones and all my emails.
Okay, that's clear. Mr. Tang?
On the use of data, this is where we need to move anyway. Banks now allow for instantaneous payments.
Sorry?
Instantaneous payments, so if you transfer your money throughout Europe, it's immediately on our bank account. That's the idea.
Instant payments, yeah.
That's service for the customers. That means that the time to block transactions or to flag them is very limited. So you need the use of big data to track down suspicious transactions, and this is why we need to share the data as well, right? So we need it anyway. So that will be the next move in this fight against suspicious transactions.
Yeah, because the banks are now expanding. In the banks in Holland, expanding their bankers that are looking for suspicious transactions. But then at the other end, there also has to be at the government some more people looking into these transactions.
Yeah, sure.
Because I understand that in 2017, the Dutch banks reported 24,000 suspicious transactions.
Yeah,
it's so much. How can you?
You have in Europe, in every country, there's a financial intelligence unit, and usually they are understaffed. We found in the European Parliament because we have been looking into these issues very much. So you have to give it more priority. It's not just about making laws; it's also about implementing them.
Yeah. Okay. This man was first, and then I see a nice young man in the back. Why not?
Hello. The word corruption is mentioned about 200 times now, but can you explain me something very basic? How does it work? Can you give me a handful of examples? How do you get your money when you want to get corrupt money? How does it work?
It's a bit of a Dutch question. We don't know that, right?
Well, maybe you know it, but I'm sure in Russia it will be different. So I'm just curious about the basics of this.
Great question.
So as I tried to communicate in this talk, corruption in Russia is pervasive, comprehensive, multifaceted. So it works in all kinds of ways. And sometimes it works through shuffling cash around, giving bags of cash literally from person to person. Sometimes people produce services. So I want you to pay me something, and we sign a contract where I provide consulting services for you. I never produce any services. We sign a piece of paper which says Sergei's consulting services were beautiful and the most amazing, and so I pay $1 million. And this is a very simple thing. So I don't know. I also can hire your kid for a job where this kid doesn't do anything. So one of the recent scandals was Deutsche Bank scandal, both in China and in Russia, where in China they would give expensive gifts to government officials to get business from government companies. In Russia, Deputy Finance Minister's daughter was hired in London, and now it's a scandal and an investigation in Germany. So this particular bank, Deutsche Bank, would get business from Russian government. So this is another example would be Daimler case. I don't know, it's been 10-15 years, where Daimler was found to be corrupt. So they actually paid bribes to Russian government officials, most likely in cash. I don't remember right now. Russian government saw this verdict and said, okay, we will not investigate those government officials. In Germany, there was a verdict. In Russia, they said, we don't care. We've not seen that. But in general, it's either cash or fake contracts. Yeah.
Yeah. Or you mentioned the kickbacks with Salvini. You make something more expensive than it is.
Yeah, you sell something at a higher price. So, and again, in many cases, it's also hidden through a service contract. So one particular friend of Russian president has a trading firm, oil trading firm. So you sell Russian oil to Switzerland, to his firm. He buys it at a low price. And he says, trading is tough business, so I need to buy at a low price because I need my commission. He resells it to other firms at a higher price. Why wouldn't Russian oil firm, which is usually a big company with many economists, lawyers, finance professionals, so on, why would the Russian firm not sell it directly to the Western market, not through this oil trader? Good question. But everybody knows you'd better use this trader. And so it looks like a deal with a commission, but of course everybody knows that this is not a random oil trader.
Okay.
Hi, my name is Bart. I have a question to both.
Can I just say another thing is you give a bureaucrat a share in your company. Yeah. So one of the biggest scandals recently was a banker from a competing investment bank, an American banker who is now working for UBS, actually during the nationalization of UCAS, gave one of important people in Russia just a stake in Renaissance Capital. Anyway, just free of charge. Yeah. Sorry.
Thank you.
Yeah, so I have a question about the internet. Mr. Guriev, I've heard you talk about the anti-corruption potential of the internet in Russia. Mm-hmm. And Mr. Tang, I've heard you talk about the sort of the other way around, corruption being used through the internet to corrupt money being used through the internet to influence decisions in Europe. How to reconcile these two things? On the one hand, internet is good for anti-corruption. On the other hand, corruption through the internet can create something else.
Yeah, what can you do on either side? Yes.
So there is a paper which I advise you to read. It's a paper we wrote literally a few weeks ago called 3G Penetration in Government and Confidence in Government. And basically, internet delivers critical messages, and sometimes it helps populists. And the reason is populists use social media better than mainstream politicians. This is not the first time in history when populists use new technology better than the elites. Why? Because if you're a populist who wants to run your campaign through established media, you're done. You have no chance because you have gatekeepers, you have good journalists, they will not transmit your fake news, your false news. But you can circumvent mainstream, and that makes you likely to succeed in your delivering of your populist message. Scott always wants to mention America, so let's mention America on this particular account. Basically, populists who don't use internet have no chance. Famous. Populists who use Twitter and social media have a chance. Now, once again, this is not first time in history. Nazi Germany, Nazis used radio to come to power. There is research on this. American populists, actually good people, 100 years ago, People's Party, more than 100 years ago, used telegraph. So this is completely normal that first new communication technology is taken up by populists, and then mainstream politicians learn and fight them. And so there are examples of Mr. Macron or Mr. Obama who use that very successfully. But I think mainstream politicians need to wake up to those things. But read this paper, it's actually right there. We look at expansion of 3G internet around the world, and we show how this expansion changes confidence in government. We also show that impact of internet is stronger if traditional media is censored. So this is also true. But it's not black and white. It sometimes delivers correct criticism, sometimes it delivers populist, incorrect criticism. So
No, because it has to do with the transparency also. Mm-hmm. The problem with is not that populists are better at, let's say, in using Instagram than I am. The problem is that they have finances behind them, and we don't know the finances behind them. So they have, where do they get the money, so to say, and who pays for the advertisement, who pays for the dark post, who pays for. This is what you need to know. And I can say, talk about corruption in the Netherlands. We don't know how political parties are financed. We like to think we are a well-organized properly behaving country, but maybe not. We simply don't know how some of the parties are financed. And this is the underlying problem, and they use then the new means of social media to have the influence and to get their way. But please, we have to be much more disclosure on the finances and who pays for the advertisement.
Okay, thank you. I have time for one more question. I'm very sorry. Yes, a lady. I'm discriminating.
Hello, my name is Anna. I have a question to Mr. Guriev. So you have mentioned that Russia now is informational autocracy. So how do you think, how likely Russian authorities to succeed in making Russian internet kind of closed within its borders, as Russian government now says autonomous internet? Thank you.
So in recent years, Russian lawmakers have passed a number of laws to try to disconnect Russian internet from the rest of the world. Yes, and it would take me literally half an hour just to describe those laws. And one of those laws, the law on sovereign internet, takes effect, I think, in November. And so the purpose of this law to defend Russia from the very likely event that America switches off internet, so Russia becomes disconnected. So this law creates an opportunity for Russia to build its own internet. I don't believe it's going to happen because we've seen the story of Telegram, where Telegram successfully defended itself against Russian government. And also Russia is not China. Russia doesn't have enough resources to build its own internet, its own firewall, and hire too many censors. So Russia has invested a lot in trolls, so these troll farms really work, and it is striking, coming back to this question, how little money you need to spend on fake social media accounts and so on and so forth to make a major impact on Western political life. But to censor every message, to monitor and censor every message like it happens pretty much in China, it's not going to be easy. So I don't believe Russian government will easily succeed in that, but they will try. And just to give you an example, when we published this paper on the expansion of 3G internet and how censorship of internet helps the government to prevent information about corruption getting out, Mr. Navalny retweeted this paper saying, "Thank you very much, we will never see 5G in Russia." And indeed, Russian government is fighting rollout of OneWeb, for example. There is this project which will beam internet from space, right? Every country thinks it's a great project, but Russia says it's undermining Russian political stability. We will see what happens with that, but still, Russian government completely understands, completely gets this informational autocracy concept. They're big pioneers in that. They learned a lot from Berlusconi. They learned from Fujimori, but they went far. And when people say, you, Mr. Guriev and Mr. Trisman, this is my co-author in this project, you tell autocrats how to run their countries. And my answer to that is, they know it better. They talk to each other. Mr. Putin travels to Egypt, tells Mr. Sisi what to do, and so on and so forth. They talk with Mr. Erdogan or Mr. Nazarbayev, and they learn from each other, and they know much better what they do than we researchers can imagine. And in that sense, I once again would like to support all initiatives to understand those regimes, because these regimes are dangerous for the future of democracy.
Thank you. I have two last questions for the... Yeah, you can clap already or wait a small moment. Two last questions for these gentlemen. One is for Mr. Tang. How far do you think we are removed from stopping this enablement that you fight against in Europe?
Well, let's at an optimistic note.
It sounds really depressing, I think, but
is that
go ahead.
No, really, on this, because what I see that, for example, there, because this leads corruption or the tax avoidance leads to a huge inequality, and the politicians have to deal with it. And to my surprise, for example, I see now the only one multilateral framework that's still functioning is the OECD on taxation. So they are making progress, even you could say principal breakthroughs, because we need to fight this type of inequality behind it. That's one of the reasons. So what the Obama administration didn't want to discuss, the Trump administration wants to discuss. That's a huge change. And that's so in that sense, I still think there's progress, but you need people to make people aware. And I think that this night is very successful in that. What is the problem? But once people realize what the problem is, I think there's also the willingness to fight, and even on a multilateral level.
That's great.
I strongly support that.
Yeah,
I think this is the most important global project, and it is a popular project, and it will proceed. And I think some people will have to pay more taxes.
And for you, Mr. Guriev, when you were in Russia working as an economist, you said just recently in a blog that you were quite optimistic about the future of your country. Yeah, because you thought we will probably implement the good laws, the good market rules and everything. How do you look at your Russia now? How is the future of your country? How far is it from the Russia you want it to be?
Well, I think I was optimistic because I understood that if Russia is corrupt, economic growth will fizzle out, and that should be understood by the government, so government will have to fight corruption. So what happened, corruption remained high and increased, economic growth disappeared, and so Mr. Putin decided that he can get more popularity through annexing neighboring territory, which worked. And that was a very bad surprise for people like me. We didn't understand how popular things like this can work in a country with this post-imperial nostalgia. Well, this country also used to be an empire, but I guess grabbing somebody else's land is not popular. Huh? But it worked until it doesn't work. And so now it looks like it doesn't work anymore. And popularity ratings of the government are coming down. What worries me is this government is so corrupt it doesn't want to leave. Also, a lot of these people actually think about the city of Hague, where they can be tried for certain crimes, war crimes in some cases fraud, but anyway. They don't want to leave. So they have stakes which are much higher than stakes of Soviet leaders. So this may be a very difficult and turbulent regime change. So I don't know about that. Another thing which worries me is that many Russians may have actually left. I mentioned this immigration intentions, and you may think you're historically optimistic, but since you want your life to be lived in a nice place with rule of law and good public goods, you may leave already. And so that was what worries me. On the optimistic note, if you ask me in 2003, can Georgia become less corrupt? Georgia at that point was much more corrupt. And then it became much less corrupt, and many people came back. And actually many people came back to make it less corrupt. And Georgia, as I said, not alone. Even in Ukraine today, which is still a very corrupt country, you see people coming back. You also see some positive changes. I mentioned Moldova, where actually a person came from off places, from a French bank in Russia, became central banker and cleaned up banking system to a great extent. I can tell you many optimistic stories, and change may happen very quickly. And I think, as I mentioned, the good news is there is nothing specifically genetically bad about Russian people. Russian people read Russian literature. Russian literature is actually about very important values of respect to justice, the call of justice, and mercy. And I think there is nothing wrong about Russian culture or Russian people. It's a normal European culture which just happened to be, at the moment, non-democratic. But that's not the only European peripheral country which was corrupt or non-democratic in the recent 100 or 200 years.
Mr. Guriev, thank you very much.